So today we're going to do a virtual toxic plant field survey. So we're going to start at the vet school using the notes that are on Learn JCU and this video, and we'll work our way through the notes and the paddock and see how we go at finding and understanding a bit about toxic plants. So we're going to walk from about building 87 up to the near the cattle yards, and then through the fence, and we'll mostly focus on this area here behind the big car park. And you can see that I've drawn lines, transect lines through the paddocks there. So to do a thorough investigation, if you're called out to a paddock or property, you would need to make a plan, something like this, to cover the whole paddock thoroughly. And it's best to do that by transects. And one thing that I often say is there's some creeks and gullies through these paddocks, and that's an area where you should cover the whole paddock, but to focus a little bit on those sort of low-lying areas that are more moist, bit better fertility, and that's often where your weeds and toxic plants occur. But cover the whole paddock. A bit of a template here that you could use. So it'll help you record things like all the plants that you see and collect, their location in the paddock, which you should mark on the map or use a GPS. You should look at the abundance of the toxic plants that you find, work out whether they're grazed or not, and how, if so, how the degree of grazing. Record whether or not you've collected a sample, and of course record if you've sent it away to get identified, and if you can identify the toxic principle. Regarding where to send your specimens away when you've collected and pressed them, normally we send them to the herbarium, official government herbarium in your whatever state you're in. And so there's an example here from the Queensland herbarium, and you'll see this template is very similar to what the information that you've recorded for your own toxic plant collections, and before that in second year your pasture and weed collection. So they ask about location, coordinates, vegetation, where it was collection, soil type, etc. So they're all things you should be well equipped to record. Your notes, I've given you a bit of a cheat sheet. So we've been surveying these horse paddocks for quite a few years now, and over the years we've collected about 35 toxic plants, and they're listed there and with their toxic principles, so you can use those. So we're going to walk up the creek towards the yards, see what we can see, and then through the yards into the horse paddocks. One of the first things we see here, of course, is rubber vine with cardiac glycosides. Round to the back of the PAF lab here, where it's shady and damp often, and here we find some oxalis. Looks like clover, but it's not. It's has a little yellow flower which I can't quite see, but oxalis, as the name suggests, contains oxalates. And if you end up working down in Victoria or somewhere, there's other species of oxalis that are time to time quite problematic. Here also, just behind the PAF lab, this is a type of pigweed, Portulaca. It's called Portulaca pilosa. So potentially oxalates and nitrates, but later hopefully we'll see some common pigweed and also some black pigweed. Down along the edge of the creek here, there's some cotton. So it's in various stages of growth. We've got cotton bolls, unopened, green, and then cotton mature, which is opened up. And inside of here is the seed, which contains gossypol. So we know cotton seed is very good feed with energy and protein, but the seed coat contains that compound gossypol, and you do have to be a little bit careful on the amount of gossypol that's fed to livestock. It can cause heart problems and also potentially sterility in young male, for example bulls. A few other things here as we get close to the yards. This is black pigweed, or sometimes called giant pigweed. It's not the true pigweed, but looks very similar and contains the same compounds, nitrates and oxalates. Going into the yards now, and the thing to note around yards, as you can see here, over the years there's lots of animals, lots of urine, lots of manure, and potentially nitrates build up into the soil. So all the plants growing around the yards, around the edge, in the yards, etc., are potentially high in nitrates. And you do hear very common of cases where animals have been mustered, left overnight in yards, come back the next morning and there's a number of them dead. And very often it's the nitrates that they've consumed overnight. Coming into the little horse paddocks around the side and then later around the back of the car park. One of the first things we come across here is some Indigofera. So Indigoferas all contain indospicine, and it's potentially toxic. So there's a number of different species of Indigofera. The one that's probably most famous that we hopefully might see is the 9-leafed indigo or Birdsville indigo. It's called Birdsville disease. It's Indigofera that's a little bit different to this one. This one's upright, erect, and fairly sizable little pods. Birdsville indigo, on the other hand, is prostrate and little round pods. We'll see that later. So these are not, this particular one's not very palatable. So the horses haven't actually browsed this one at all by the looks of it, but we'll keep our eye out. Here we have some Birdsville indigo. So Indigofera linnae. You can see the also called nine-leaf indigo. You can see the little fruits on it. So a bit different to the one we saw before, but this is the most common one that's problematic, particularly with horses. It's well known to cause problems down in the channel country in southwest Queensland, where horses get trapped between channels. They eat out the pasture and then they eat the Birdsville indigo. So it's a little prostrate plant, but can occur in quite an abundance, and there's quite a bit of it through here. A bit further into the paddock here we come across quite a big patch of sickle pod, so senna, and you can see the typical sickle pods and the caesal pinnaceae flowers. So sickle pod, this is a bad patch. It is known to particularly cause problems with cattle and diarrhea, and there's been cases of it causing death in animals, including camels. There was a guy up at Charters Towers who used camels he thought to clear out a bad paddock of weeds, including this sickle pod, and I think it was 5 camels ended up dying. Down a little bit further here, this is called green amaranthus, potentially contains nitrates, also not grazed. So I should mention The horses in these paddocks are well fed on hay and supplements, so they're not forced to eat these things, but there's certainly plenty of them around, and right beside that is a very healthy black pigweed. You can see these paddocks are quite a mess really. Very little pasture, lots of broadleafed weeds, shiny apple, rubber vine, etc. Overgrazed, long history of overgrazing, so more indigofera there, more sickle pod, and there's also a lot of wild basil in this paddock. Wild basil is not in the textbook as toxic, but we have noticed cattle, naive cattle, introduced into the vet paddocks start scouring on the wild basil. Just coming into the next paddock here. This one winds its way around behind the car park. So similar, pretty poor condition, but we'll see what we can find. So over amongst the trees here we've found a bit of lantana. So it's important to know lantana. It's a common weed, commonly cause problems, and this one has been grazed and it's not flowering, so a little bit tricky for you to identify, but a few things to note is the serrated leaf edge, the squarish stems, and it's a little bit prickly. And unfortunately you can't smell this, but if you crush it up and smell it, it's got a very aromatic odour, and it's worth having a sniff of, and then that'll stick with you. So, lantana. So this is a more typical big shrub of lantana here. Same features as we talked about before. This one's also not flowering, but you can see the little berries on it. So you'll recall that lantanas come in a lot of different colours, and the redder they are, the more toxic they're believed to be. But I'd be suspicious of them all. There's two types of lantana about. This one's called creeping lantana, so it's different from the common lantana, the big shrub, but also suspected of being toxic. There's a bit of a native shrub, small tree here. This is called Raitia, and you can see where I've just broken a bit of here. It's got latex in it, and this plant is in the Apocynaceae family, and you may recall that Apocynaceae have a number of very toxic plants in them. They're not all toxic, but potentially a lot of them are causing cardiac or having cardiac glycosides in them. So this one is not grazed, probably causes no problem, but potentially toxic. And just to remind you, the Apocynaceae family have flowers which look a bit like a propeller of a plane. So that helps identify that family. And here we come across some roly-poly salsalsa. So this is quite a green one, a young one, and it's succulent. When these get older, they get quite prickly and hard and unpalatable. When they're like this, they can be grazed. There's a few more over here, younger ones. So when there's not much else around, livestock will graze these, and they contain calcium oxalates. Across a bit of a creek here, and up the edge on the bank is this shrub, and this is a myoporum, and you can see little berries on this one. It goes purple and tiny little flowers in there. These occur across lots of inland Australia especially, and can contain cyanides. down the far end of the paddocks now, and you can see there's a bit of an outbreak here of Negura burr. Got the little burrs on it there. So you'll remember Negura burr is toxic, and particularly when it's in this two-leaf seedling stage. So in a gully creek like this, you can see, so we're in the bottom of a creek bed, sandy alluvial sort of soil. This is ideal habitat for Negura burr. It germinates very quickly in the start of a wet season or after a storm. Millions of little burrs germinate, cotyledons come up, and often that's quicker than the associated pastures or grasses, and animals will, because there's nothing much else around, will start grazing the two-leaf stage of the Negura burr. Coming back now along the edge of the paddocks. So here they're growing along the fence, two things, some rubber vine and also a type of Ipomea or morning glory, and you can see the fruits on those, potentially nitrates. And here we've come across some wild cucumbers. So the vine is actually gone, withered away, but the fruit are left here. And the problem with these wild cucumbers is they do contain a compound, cucurbitins, and these fruits lie around for months and months, sometimes in big masses of them, and later on, and nothing much else to eat, livestock will start to graze them. And if we have a look in there, you can see these are really like a cucumber. They smell and taste cucumber. There's some gomphrena around as well. Gomphrena is a herbaceous plant, unknown toxin, and it's listed in Mackenzie as probably nitrates. Over here, just on the edge of the paddock, and sometimes in the paddock, we've come across a bit of Neptunia. There's a few plants here. These are just small ones, and this is Neptunia major. But the important thing to note that out in Western Queensland, around Hughenden, Richmond, very similar plant called Neptunia amplexicaulus accumulates selenium out of the cracking clay soils and is potentially toxic. So this one grows along the coast, and the amplexicaulus grows out west. They look very similar, except for the one out west grows a bit bigger leaves and prostrate along the ground, more like that. But it's only the one out west, the amplexicaulus, is the one that's known to cause problems with selenium. To wind up our little survey, we're up in the toxic plant garden, and just quickly to remind you of a number of things here. Just right here, this is alamander. It's an ornamental shrub containing alamandine, and growing up through it is leucaena. So leucaena, we talked about previously, contains mimosine and can be quite problematic in reducing cattle live weight gain particularly, but also produces goiter, hair loss, etc., but can be detoxified by the use of the rumen bug. And just down the bottom here, so previously I mentioned the family Apocynaceae, so that flower should remind you of a propeller of a plane, and so it's an Apocynaceae family, and this plant is called vinca or Madagascan periwinkle, and they contain huge number of alkaloids. Devil's fig growing here in the pot. So these are in the Solanaceae family, so potatoes, tomatoes, and I've seen cattle graze these across the fence just here, and they potentially contain solanines. And here in a pot we have the normal pigweed, portulaca. So this is very typical portulaca, and this one's not flowering, but they come in a range of different flowers, often yellow, but there's some ornamental ones as well. So these have these succulent leaves. These often germinate and very common in paddocks after rain. Animals, and they come up quick, animals will graze them in preference to other things, particularly in dry times. So they contain nitrates and oxalates. Another odd looking plant here, no leaves. This is called pencil caustic, and occurs out in a dry country. And again, if nothing much else to eat, animals will start to browse this. Often in Gidgee, Mulga country, out around Longreach and those sort of places. Contains pregnone glycosides. And you can see the sap in that one. Some rattlepods here, so cradle areas. We saw down at St Margaret's Creek as well. So these contain your pyrrolizidine alkaloids. There's a lot of different species of rattlepods, and you could be suspicious of most of them as containing PAs. Some wild passion fruit here. Also potentially contains cyanide. This is a pot with grass tree in it, or Xanthoria. Also another one of those things that cattle will eat when there's not much else around, and potentially toxic. Some buffel grass, of course, we've talked about before too, and buffel grasses have high levels of oxalates, which can cause big head in horses. Another one here, this is a native vine called Abris, and very toxic. These plants, seeds, etc. There's some pods over here. These contain a compound called abrin, which is very, very toxic. So these are also called crab eye because of the black and red colour. So those are very hard seeds, probably pass through an animal mostly, except for if they were chewed up, and then they're very, very toxic. So crab eye or Abris occurs in the native feedlands around here. It's worth noting too that some of these brachiarias or urocloas, like Brachiaria decumbens, this one here, can contain compounds that can be problematic. It's important pasture, but occasionally you get photosensitization, etc. They contain steroidal compounds and also oxalates. And some of the guinea grasses will do that as well. There are a few other things around campus too worth pointing out to you. This is of course castor oil plant containing ricin, and you can see the fruits, tiny little things up the top there. So very common along creeks, rivers, alluvial areas, pretty much right across Australia. Very toxic, all parts of the plant. So that pretty much wraps up our paddock walk, paddock survey, and interesting to note that I think we saw 18 or 19 of these different toxic plants. So hopefully that's a refresher for you, and you'll keep toxic plants at the top of your minds in the future, and I'm sure you'll come across cases. So yeah, of the 35 or so that we've collected out of those paddocks over the last few years, finding 18 or 19 today is fairly remarkable. So if our horses, cattle, sheep weren't well fed, there's plenty of potential for some poisoning events there. So that's about it. Thank you. Good luck.